The crystal wine glass tipped off the silver tray and came down across the front of her emerald silk gown, dark Bordeaux, soaking into $15,000 of fabric. She lost control instantly, her voice cutting through the ballroom sharp and ice cold, dragging every eye in the room toward her. But what silenced the crowd wasn't her fury. It was the waiter's response. He didn't apologize the way they expected. He didn't step back. And in exactly 10 seconds, the entire room turned against her, leaving her standing alone, the new center of humiliation. Who was this man? The Ashford Grand Ballroom was the kind of place where money didn't speak. It whispered. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations over a floor of white Italian marble, and every surface had been polished until it caught the light twice. The annual Ashford Foundation Gala was the most exclusive event of the winter season in the city, and tonight, the room held somewhere close to 300 guests. Senators, hedge fund partners, a federal judge in the far corner, the kind of crowd that measured a man by the cut of his jacket before it bothered to learn his name. Presiding over all of it was Margaret Whitaker, the head of the foundation, a tall, gray-haired woman who moved through her own room with the quiet authority of someone who had been hosting this particular evening for 11 years. She greeted each arrival at the entrance with a practiced warmth and a memory for names that had built her reputation long before her wealth had. Adrian Cole moved between them without sound. His uniform was plain black, pressed sharp at the shoulders, and he carried a silver tray with the steady balance of someone who had done the work for a long time. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-30s, with short dark hair and a face that most people looked past without registering. That was the point. A good waiter at an event like this was expected to be invisible, a pair of hands, and a polite voice, nothing more. Adrian had learned that lesson years ago, and he wore it the way other men wore their watches. He had taken this gig through a temp agency that handled the high-end circuit. 6 hours on his feet, a flat rate, and the tips were usually generous when the open bar was free. He had his reasons for needing the money, reasons he kept to himself, and he hadn't spoken more than 10 words to the other staff all evening. The head manager, a thin man named Gregory Hale, had given him the difficult section on purpose, the raised platform near the center, where the most important guests gathered. Gregory liked to test the new hires. Adrian hadn't complained. Early in the evening, Adrian had poured a glass of whiskey for an older man in a navy tuxedo seated near the window. The man had taken the glass without looking up at first, and then, as Adrian turned to leave, he had looked up. His eyes had stayed on Adrian's hands for a beat longer than courtesy required, and then on his shoulders, and then on his face. Adrian had felt the look and chosen not to meet it. He had moved on. The older man had not called him back. Across the room, Vanessa Clark was holding court beside the ice sculpture. She ran a boutique public relations firm that handled reputations for people who could not afford to have their reputations handled badly. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a low knot, and the diamonds at her throat were old money. What no one in the room could have guessed was that 40 minutes before the gala began, she had ended a call in the back of her car with the deputy of a client she had represented for 6 years. A call that had ended with the words, "We are going to have a very different kind of conversation on Monday." She had stepped out of the car into the cold with her face composed and her shoulders back. And she had decided the way she always decided when something slipped, that tonight she would simply be the brightest thing in the room and let the room remember it. She had spent the last hour reminding 3 different guests of exactly how much she was worth to them. She understood one thing very clearly. In a room like this, the person who controlled the conversation controlled the night. She was in the middle of laughing at something one of the foundation board members had said when she gestured too widely with her left hand. Adrian, stepping past the edge of the platform to clear a place at the nearest high top, had judged the line of her movement wrong by 6 inches. Her gold bracelet caught the edge of his tray. At the same moment, his hip brushed the back of her arm. The tray tipped, the glass tipped with it, and a full pour of vintage Bordeaux arced out in a slow red ribbon and came down across the front of her emerald silk. For a single beat, the ballroom noise continued as if nothing had happened. Then Vanessa looked down. The sound she made was not a scream. It was something lower and colder, the hiss of a woman watching $15,000 of fabric ruin itself in real time. The guests around her went quiet first, and the silence spread outward like a ripple across still water. Adrian had already set the tray down on the nearest high top. He kept his hands visible and spoke with the flat professionalism the job required. "Ma'am, I apologize. That was on me. If you'll come with me to the side room, the service team can help with the gown immediately." "Do not," Vanessa said. "Speak to me." Her voice cut. It was trained for this, built over 2 decades of boardrooms and press conferences, and she used it now like a blade. She lifted her eyes from the ruined fabric and looked at Adrian for the first time. She knew in the small, honest part of her that she rarely consulted that her hand had moved into his tray. She had felt the bracelet catch, but the room was watching, and she had arrived tonight, carrying something she was not willing to set down in front of them. And so she did what she had been trained to do. She chose a story. She chose the story in which the fault was his. "Do you have any idea what this is?" she said. Her voice was climbing now, deliberate, pitched to carry. "Do you understand what you just did? This gown was made for me. Made. And you walk through this room like you belong here, and you ruin it in front of half the city. Ma'am, I'm sorry. If you'll let me, an accident." She gave a short, sharp laugh that had nothing warm in it. "You people never know how to stand in a room. You never know where your hands are. Do you have any idea what this evening costs? Do you even know who I am?" A small knot of guests had started drifting closer. A few phones came up, held low-angled toward the platform. Adrian could see the red recording dots in his peripheral vision, without needing to look. He kept his breathing even. He had been in worse rooms than this one, under worse circumstances, and the one thing he had learned was that anger was a weapon that only hurt the person holding it, as long as you refused to pick it up yourself. "I'll get the manager," he said quietly. "You are going to stand there," Vanessa said, "and you are going to listen to me." Gregory Hale had already materialized at the edge of the scene. He was wringing his hands, his face the particular shade of pale that managers turn when a client threatens a lawsuit. He started to say something smooth and apologetic, but Vanessa did not take her eyes off Adrian. "I want his name," she said. "I want the name of the company that sent him. I want him walked out of this building tonight, and I want a written guarantee that he will never work another event in this city." Gregory swallowed. "Ma'am, of course we'll handle—" "I'm not finished." She stepped forward. The emerald silk, now blotched black with wine, shifted around her legs as she moved, and something about that movement, the ruined fabric, the audience, the unanswered call from earlier, seemed to push her past the last line of control she had been holding. She closed the distance between herself and Adrian in 3 short steps, and before Gregory could get his hand up to stop her, she reached out and closed her fingers around the front of Adrian's collar. It was not a shove, it was a grip. The kind of grip a person uses when they want the other person to feel small. She twisted the fabric hard enough that the button at the top of his shirt strained against the thread, and she pulled him half a step toward her so that the room could see exactly who was in control of the moment. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," she said. A few of the guests gasped. One of the older women, a donor Adrian had served earlier in the night, brought a hand up to her mouth. A man in a charcoal suit near the back muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "Jesus Christ." Adrian did not move. He did not pull back. He did not raise his own hands to hers. He looked down at the fist on his collar, and then he looked up at Vanessa's face, and his expression did not change at all. There was no fear in it. There was no anger. There was only a very quiet, very still attention, the kind of attention that a certain kind of man learns in places that do not forgive mistakes. For the first time all night, Vanessa felt something small and uncertain move in her chest. The face in front of her was not reacting the way it was supposed to. A man grabbed by the collar in front of 300 people was supposed to flinch, or apologize, or shake. Adrian was doing none of those things. He was simply looking at her. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was lower now, perfectly level. "I'd like you to let go of my shirt." She did not let go. She tightened her grip instead, because she had spent 2 decades learning that the way you won a room was by never being the first one to blink. "You will stand there," she said, and her voice had the edge now of someone who had noticed the cameras and understood that backing down would be worse than the ruined dress. "Until I decide we are finished." Gregory was making small sounds behind her. Something about, "Please," and maybe we could step outside, but no one was listening to him. The room had narrowed down to 2 people. A woman in a ruined gown holding a waiter by the collar, and a waiter who was not moving, not arguing, not begging, simply standing there with a stillness that was starting to feel wrong in a way the crowd could not yet name. Adrian took a slow breath. He had a choice in front of him, and he could feel the shape of it clearly. He could keep enduring this and hope she tired herself out, which would protect the paycheck and the reference and the next job. Or he could refuse to be moved and let whatever came next come. He thought for a fraction of a second of the reasons he needed this work. He thought of the quiet apartment he would go back to at 2 in the morning. He thought of the man he used to be before he chose this quieter life. And then he made his choice. He did not step back. He did not apologize again. He held her gaze, and he kept his hands open at his sides, and he let the silence do the thing that silence does when a woman who is used to winning suddenly realizes the man in front of her is not afraid of her at all. The silence stretched long enough to become its own sound. Vanessa's fingers were still twisted into the collar of Adrian's shirt, but her grip had changed without her deciding to change it. The certainty had gone out of it. She could feel the fabric under her hand, the warm stillness of the man behind it, and for the first time, she registered that the crowd wasn't watching her the way a crowd watches a winner. They were watching her the way a crowd watches something go wrong in slow motion. She did what people like her always did when they felt the floor shift. She pushed harder. "I'm sorry. Am I embarrassing you?" Her voice climbed again, louder, now performative. "Is this uncomfortable for you? Maybe next time you'll think twice before walking through a room full of people who matter." A woman near the bar, silver hair, a cream-colored suit. A senator's wife Adrian had poured champagne for an hour earlier, set her glass down with a small, deliberate click. Her expression had gone very flat. Nearby, the older man in the navy tuxedo lifted his phone. He was not smiling. His jaw was tight in a way that said the video would not be kind to Vanessa when it left the room. Gregory Hale stepped forward at last, his hands raised in the small, surrendering way of a manager who had decided the client was no longer worth protecting. "Miss Clark, please, let's step into the side lounge, and I will personally handle the replacement of—" "Stay out of this, Gregory." Her voice cracked on his name just slightly. It was a crack so small that most of the room would not have heard it, but Adrian heard it. He had been listening for it. He knew the sound of a person losing the thread of their own performance, and Vanessa had just reached it. She did not know it yet, but her body did. She let go of his collar with a sharp shove, the kind of shove meant to make him stumble backward, so the moment could be reset in her favor. Adrian did not stumble. He took half a step to absorb the push, and then he was standing exactly where he had been, hands still open at his sides, expression still unchanged. The crowd saw it. That was the moment it broke loose in her. All the evening's pressure, the ruined gown, the eyes, the call from earlier in the car, the quiet refusal of the waiter in front of her to be afraid. She stepped back in and raised her hand, and this time, there was no ambiguity about what she meant to do. Her open palm came forward in a hard, flat arc, aimed at the side of Adrian's face. What happened next took somewhere between 8 and 10 seconds, and half the room would argue about the exact timing for weeks afterward. Adrian's right hand came up. It did not travel far. It did not swing. It moved in a short, economical arc, the way a door closes when it has been hung correctly, and the blade of his palm met the inside of her wrist at the exact moment her slap was meant to land. There was a soft, clean sound, more of a tap than a strike, and her arm was redirected down and outward along a line that took every ounce of her forward momentum with it. Vanessa's body followed her arm because her arm had been committed to the motion. She stepped through a blow that had met nothing, and her heel, which had not been built for a polished floor, slid out from underneath her. She twisted. Her other hand reached for something that was not there. The crowd watched her entire center of gravity leave her, and Adrian's left hand came up not to catch her exactly, but to set a single point of contact against her elbow that stopped her from going down onto her knees. He held her there for one breath, just long enough for the room to register that he had controlled both the blow and the fall, and then he let go. Vanessa staggered backward 3 steps. Her heel caught the edge of the small raised platform and bent sideways. She went down off the edge of it, not hard, but completely onto the floor, beside the platform, in her $15,000 gown, in front of 300 people. And the room around her was full of quiet light and raised phones. The sound that came out of her was not a word. It was a small, wounded noise, the kind of sound a person makes when they finally understand that the story of the evening has been rewritten around them, and they were not the one holding the pen. No one helped her up. That was the thing that would haunt her later in the car on the way home. In the silent apartment at 2 in the morning, in every replay of the video that would be sent to her by people pretending to be concerned. 300 of the wealthiest people in the city, and not one of them moved. They just watched. Adrian stepped back. He did not look down at her. He did not offer a hand. He simply turned his head slightly toward Gregory and said in the same flat, professional voice he had used the entire evening, "I'll need someone else to finish my section." Gregory nodded without speaking. His face had gone the color of wet paper. For a few seconds, the ballroom held its breath, and then the noise came back in pieces. A low murmur first. Then the soft rush of people trying to pretend they had not just seen what they had seen. A woman near the dessert table said, "My God," loud enough for a microphone somewhere to catch it. The older man in the navy tuxedo lowered his phone and nodded once to himself, the way a person nods when a debt has been settled. On the floor, Vanessa pushed herself up onto one elbow. Her knot of blonde hair had come loose. A strand of it hung in front of her face, and she did not brush it away, because brushing it away would have required admitting that she was in the position where a strand of hair needed to be brushed away. The wine stain on her gown had widened. There was a small red smear on her palm from where she had caught herself. She stared at Adrian's back as he moved away from her, and something in her chest was doing something she could not remember it doing before. A younger woman in a black cocktail dress crouched down beside her. "Vanessa. Vanessa, honey. Come on. Let's get you up." "Get away from me." "Vanessa." "I said get away from me." The younger woman stood up slowly. She looked around the room, and whatever she saw there made her take a step backward, and then another. And then she turned and walked toward the bar without saying anything else. Vanessa watched her go, and she understood in that particular lonely way that people in her industry understand things, that the woman who had just walked away from her was someone who had called her 3 times this week, asking for an introduction. She got to her feet on her own. It took longer than it should have because the heel on her left shoe had bent completely sideways. She stood there at the edge of the platform, one shoe at a right angle, the emerald silk ruined at the front and smeared at the knees, her hair half down, and she looked out at the room that had 15 minutes earlier been hers. They were not looking back at her. They were looking past her. They were looking at the video that was already being airdropped across the ballroom from pocket to pocket, the way a small fire moves through dry grass. She could see it on their faces, the little downward glances at screens, the small, involuntary widening of eyes. The way two board members near the entrance leaned toward each other and whispered, and then, very carefully, did not look back at her again. 30 feet away, Adrian was already moving through the service door that led to the back of house. He did not look back either. Vanessa's phone began to vibrate in the small clutch hanging from her wrist. She did not need to look at it to know what it was. A client, probably the first of several. She opened the clutch anyway. The screen showed the name of the client whose deputy had called her in the car, the same retainer, the same voice, the same Monday meeting that had apparently decided not to wait until Monday. She did not answer. She closed the clutch and looked back toward the service door, as if the man who had just walked through it could somehow undo the last 10 minutes by walking back out. He did not come back out. On the far side of the room, Margaret Whittaker was making her way through the crowd. Her expression was polite in the way that very powerful women's expressions are polite when they are about to end something. She was moving toward Vanessa with a small, fixed smile, and behind her, 2 members of the Foundation's security detail were following at a respectful distance. Vanessa watched her come, and she understood that she was about to be asked to leave. She had been to this gala every year for 11 years. She had donated. She had introduced board members to their future husbands. She had once single-handedly saved the Foundation from a public relations crisis that would have closed it. And now Margaret Whittaker was walking across the room with 2 men in earpieces behind her, and the smile on Margaret's face was the smile of a woman who had already made the call. Vanessa's hand closed around the clutch so tightly that the clasp bit into her palm. The phone inside it vibrated again. And somewhere out in the city, on 1,000 timelines and a dozen group chats, the first frame of the video was being uploaded, captioned, and sent, and the woman in the emerald gown was becoming in real time someone entirely new. Someone she did not want to be. Someone she could not stop becoming. Margaret Whittaker stopped 3 feet from Vanessa and did not extend a hand. She did not need to. The 2 men behind her in gray suits stayed exactly where they were, close enough to be understood, as an answer far enough to be understood, as a courtesy. "Vanessa," Margaret said. Her voice was warm the way a closed door is warm. "Let's get you somewhere quiet." "Margaret, I've asked Daniel to bring your car around. Your coat is already at the front. We'll take you out through the side corridor so you don't have to walk through the main hall." The kindness in the sentence was the thing that broke her. If Margaret had been cold, Vanessa could have been cold back. She had built an entire career on being colder than whoever she was talking to. But Margaret was using the tone she used at funerals, the tone reserved for people who had already lost the thing they were about to be told they had lost, and Vanessa heard it clearly. She opened her mouth to argue. Nothing came out. The ballroom behind Margaret was a soft blur of motion, guests turning away politely, the string quartet starting up again in the far corner, as if the evening could be resumed. No one was looking directly at her. That was worse than if they had been. "Margaret, please," Vanessa said. Her voice was quieter now, and she hated the sound of it. He provoked me. He did not apologize correctly. If you look at the footage, "I have looked at the footage," Margaret said. 3 people have already shown it to me. Come with me, Vanessa." The 2 men in gray suits shifted their weight very slightly. It was not a threat. It was a clock running down. Vanessa closed her mouth. She bent down, and with as much dignity as a woman with 1 broken heel could summon, slipped both shoes off and held them in her left hand. She walked off the platform in her stockings, following Margaret, and the floor was cold under her feet. No one spoke to her. No one reached out. The woman who had crouched beside her 10 minutes earlier was standing near the bar with her back turned, laughing too loudly at something the bartender had said. In the back corridor out of sight of the main hall, Margaret stopped and turned to face her. The warmth in her voice was still there. So was the steel underneath it. I need you to understand something before you leave. The Foundation is not going to make a statement. We are not going to comment. But I think you already know that you are not going to be on next year's list. Vanessa opened her clutch. The phone inside it had stopped vibrating. She looked down at the screen. 7 missed calls. 4 of them were the client whose name she had seen earlier. 2 were from her own assistant. 1 was from a journalist at a business weekly who had her personal number, which meant the story was already moving. She closed the clutch without answering any of them. "Margaret," she said, "I've given this foundation. I know what you've given us." There was nothing to say after that. Margaret turned and walked back toward the ballroom, and the 2 men in gray suits moved into position on either side of Vanessa and walked her at a respectful distance toward the side exit. Back in the main room, Adrian had come through the service door again. He was carrying a new tray, and the collar of his shirt had been straightened. He moved back to his section the way he had moved through it all night, steady and unobtrusive, and he began clearing the platform where the wine had fallen. He did not speak to the guests who watched him. He did not acknowledge the phones that were still quietly aimed at him. The older man in the navy tuxedo walked over to him. He was maybe 60 silver at the temples, his hand resting on the stem of a whiskey glass. It was the same man Adrian had served earlier, the one whose eyes had lingered a second too long on his hands. "Son?" Adrian straightened, holding a stack of empty glasses. "Sir, where did you train?" Something in Adrian's face moved and went still again. It was the smallest thing, a flicker at the edge of his mouth, and anyone not looking for it would have missed it. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir." "Yes, you are." The older man's voice was not unkind. "That was a wrist redirect, the kind they teach you after the basic course, not before. You absorbed her weight on the elbow without locking the joint. You didn't put her on the floor when you could have. I noticed the way you held the whiskey glass when you brought it to me earlier. I've only seen that done clean by 2 kinds of men in my life." Adrian did not answer. "Army Sorin." "Marines," Adrian said quietly. "A long time ago. Close protection after." "For a while." The older man nodded once the way men nod to each other when a thing has been established that does not need to be discussed further. "My name is Harold Beck. I run a firm that handles private security for principals who cannot afford the kind of scene we just watched." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a thin card and held it out. "If you ever want to stop carrying trays, call that number." Adrian took the card. He did not look at it. He slipped it into the back pocket of his black trousers, the way a man accepts something without yet deciding what to do with it. "Thank you, sir." "No," Harold said. "Thank you. You could have heard her. A lot of men would have. The fact that you didn't is the only reason the video going around right now is going to be a problem for her and not for you." Harold lifted the whiskey glass finally and took a small sip and walked back toward his table without saying anything else. Adrian finished clearing the platform. He wiped the floor clean where the wine had fallen. He carried the tray of broken glass to the back of house, and he came back and resumed his rotation. Within 20 minutes, the ballroom sounded like a ballroom again. The string quartet was on its second piece. The canapes were circulating. Someone at the far end of the room had told a joke, and a small group of board members were laughing in the careful, restored way that rich people laugh after a scene. The gala did not end early. That was the thing Vanessa would think about later, alone in the back of the car with her shoes in her lap. The gala did not end early. The room had simply closed around the empty space where she had been, and kept moving. The car moved slowly through the cold city. Vanessa looked out the window without seeing any of it. Her phone had started vibrating again. She let it. Somewhere between the foundation building and the river, she opened her clutch and took the phone out and looked at the screen. A notification banner across the top showed the first line of a message from her largest client. "Vanessa. We need to talk first thing Monday. Do not call before then." She read the sentence 3 times. She already knew what the meeting on Monday was going to be. She had known since the call in the parking lot 4 hours earlier. She had walked into the gala knowing, and she had tried to outshine the knowledge, and the knowledge had walked in with her anyway, and sat down at her table and waited. She lowered the phone into her lap. Outside, the city was going by in long panels of light, and she could see her own face faintly in the dark glass. There was a streak of wine on her cheek that she had not noticed. There was a red mark on her collarbone where the diamonds had pressed when she fell. She looked at her own reflection the way a stranger might, and for the first time in a very long time, she asked herself a question she did not have a trained answer for. She asked herself whether the thing she was angry about was the wine, or the dress, or the crowd, or the call in the parking lot, or something older than any of them that she had been carrying for longer than she could remember. It had not been the accident. She understood that now. The accident had been nothing. A glass of wine, a stain, a staff incident that any assistant could have handled before the main course. It had been her reaction, her voice climbing, her hand reaching. Her decision to treat a man she did not know as something less than a person, because the room was watching, and she had wanted the room to see her win a fight. She had, in truth, been losing all evening in silence, and he had not let her win. He had not punished her either. That was the part she could not stop turning over. He had stopped her. Hand stopped her fall, stepped back and refused to look down at her when she was on the floor. A man with every reason to make the moment his had instead given it back to her empty. She did not know what to do with the kindness of that. It felt worse than if he had shouted. Back in the ballroom, Adrian worked the rest of the evening without incident. He was polite. He was efficient. He did not mention what had happened. Not to Gregory when the manager tried awkwardly to apologize on behalf of the agency, and not to the other waiters, who had of course heard. Near midnight, as the crowd thinned, a young woman in a dark blue dress stopped him as he passed. She appeared to be in her late 20s, an associate at one of the law firms on the guest list, and she looked at him, the way people sometimes looked at him, when they were trying to work out if a thing they had seen had really been what they thought it was. "I just wanted to say," she said, and then seemed to lose the end of the sentence. "You don't have to say anything," Adrian said quietly. "But thank you." She nodded and moved on. At 1:15 in the morning, the last guests left. By 2, the staff had finished breaking down the floral arrangements and stacking the chairs. Adrian collected his jacket from the back hall. Gregory tried to press an extra $200 into his hand as a kind of unspoken apology. Adrian looked at the money for a second and handed back everything but the agreed-upon rate. "We agreed on a number, Gregory. That's the number. I appreciate the thought." He walked out through the service door into the cold. The city was quiet in the way it only got quiet at 2 in the morning, and his breath came out in a long, white line. He pulled the card Harold Beck had given him out of his back pocket. He looked at the number under the streetlight. He thought about it for a moment, and then he slipped it back into his wallet without deciding anything. He could decide in the morning. He could decide next week. That was the thing about having made the choice to stop being someone he used to be. You were allowed to take your time with the next one. Somewhere across the city, a woman in a ruined emerald gown was sitting on the edge of a hotel bed, not her own, because she did not want to be alone in her apartment tonight. She was watching the video on her phone for the 4th time. She was watching the moment her hand came up. She was watching the stillness in the waiter's face, and she was beginning, slowly, painfully, to understand that respect was not something you demanded from a room. It was something you earned from yourself in the small, quiet moments when no one was watching at all. And that a single loss of that respect in front of the right witnesses could unmake in 10 seconds the image a person had spent 20 years building. Adrian walked home under the streetlights. The card stayed in his wallet. The city kept moving. And behind him the night folded itself closed, the way nights do when a thing has been settled that did not need another word.